The date was November 1942, and in a dimly lit command tent somewhere in the suffocating heat of Papua New Guinea, General Douglas MacArthur held a telegram in his trembling hands. His face had gone pale. Not from fear. Not from shock. But from something far more dangerous for a man of his towering ego. Disbelief mixed with grudging respect for someone he had publicly dismissed as incompetent just weeks earlier. The telegram contained 3 words that would forever change the Pacific War. Blamey has won. 12,000 Japanese soldiers. Veterans of the most brutal campaigns across Asia. Warriors who had conquered Singapore, terrorized China, and made the Imperial Army a force that struck terror into the hearts of anyone who stood in their way. 12,000 of them. And an Australian General MacArthur had called too cautious, and lacking in offensive spirit, had just crushed them in a victory so complete, so devastating, that it would force MacArthur to eat every word of criticism he had ever spoken. But this story doesn't begin with victory. It begins with humiliation. With betrayal. With a moment so dark that the entire Australian nation held its breath, wondering if their sons fighting in the jungle would ever come home. 6 months earlier, the Japanese war machine had seemed unstoppable. They had swept through Southeast Asia like a tidal wave of steel and fury. Hong Kong had fallen in weeks. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore had surrendered in what Winston Churchill called the most humiliating defeat in British military history. The Dutch East Indies had crumbled. Burma was lost. And now, like a predator circling wounded prey, Japan had set its sights on Australia itself. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Japanese forces would capture Port Moresby on the southern coast of Papua New Guinea. From there, they would use it as a launching point to invade Australia. The distance was short. The defenses were minimal. And the Australian military was stretched impossibly thin, with most of their best troops fighting in North Africa under British command. General Thomas Blamey stood in his headquarters, studying maps that told a story of impending disaster. He was not the general anyone expected to save Australia. At 58 years old, with a reputation as a political operator rather than a battlefield commander, many questioned whether he had what it took to face the Japanese juggernaut. His own soldiers whispered doubts. His American allies barely concealed their contempt. And MacArthur, the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Pacific, had made it clear he viewed Blamey as an obstacle rather than an asset. But Blamey understood something that MacArthur, with all his medals and ego, did not. He understood the Australian soldier. He knew what they were capable of when pushed to their absolute limit. And he knew that the jungle hell of Papua New Guinea would not be won by textbook tactics or by throwing masses of men into frontal assaults. It would be won by soldiers who could endure the unendurable. The Kokoda Track. Just saying those words would later make grown men weep. A narrow, treacherous path that wound through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Mountains that rose almost vertically from the jungle floor. Rain that fell in sheets so thick you couldn't see 5 feet in front of your face. Mud that sucked at your boots with every step as if the earth itself was trying to pull you down into hell. And everywhere disease. Malaria. Dysentery. Tropical ulcers that ate through flesh down to the bone. The Japanese had begun their advance in July. Elite troops from the South Seas Detachment, veterans of victories across the Pacific. They moved fast, expecting to sweep aside whatever Australian resistance they encountered and reach Port Moresby within weeks. What they found instead were Australian militia troops, barely trained kids some of them, who refused to break. Blamey watched the reports come in. His forces were outnumbered. They were retreating. The Japanese were pushing closer and closer to Port Moresby. And MacArthur was losing his mind with impatience. In his command post in Brisbane, MacArthur paced like a caged tiger. He didn't understand why Blamey wasn't launching immediate counterattacks. He didn't comprehend the reality of jungle warfare. He saw only what looked like continuous retreat, and it infuriated him. He began sending messages that grew increasingly hostile. He questioned Blamey's courage. He suggested that the Australians lacked fighting spirit. He even intimated that perhaps American troops should take over the entire operation. These messages reached Blamey in his command post. He read them without expression, then carefully folded them away. He would not be rushed. He would not sacrifice his men on the altar of MacArthur's ego. Because Blamey knew something that MacArthur had not yet grasped. The Japanese were extending their supply lines with every step forward. They were exhausting themselves in terrain that destroyed the strongest men. And when they finally reached the limit of their advance, when they were hungry, sick, and far from reinforcement, that was when Blamey would strike. September arrived. The Japanese had advanced to within striking distance of Port Moresby. Australian newspapers ran headlines asking if the nation would fall. Politicians in Canberra prepared contingency plans for evacuation. And still Blamey waited. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the tide began to shift. The Japanese advance had stalled. Their soldiers were starving. Disease was ripping through their ranks even faster than it was destroying the Australians. Reports from reconnaissance patrols indicated something that Blamey had been waiting for. The enemy was vulnerable. Blamey gave the order. The Australian forces, reinforced now with fresh troops who had finally arrived from the Middle East, would counterattack. But this would not be a simple reversal. This would be a pursuit without mercy. A grinding, relentless advance that would give the Japanese no time to rest, no time to dig in, no time to recover. The Australian soldiers, men who had been pushed back step by agonizing step through the hell of the Kokoda Track, now became hunters. They knew this terrain now. They had learned to survive in conditions that broke normal men. They had adapted to jungle warfare in ways that the Japanese, for all their training, had not anticipated. Every village the Japanese had taken became a new battlefield. Every ridge became a killing ground. The Australians, supported by small aircraft dropping supplies and a trickle of artillery that somehow had been dragged through the impossible terrain, began to destroy the Japanese forces piece by piece. At a place called Templeton's Crossing, Australian troops caught a large Japanese force attempting to retreat across a river. The battle that followed was so intense that the river ran red. Japanese soldiers, desperate and starving, fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. But the Australians, fueled by months of anger at being pushed back, at watching their friends die in the mud, gave no quarter. By late October the Japanese were in full retreat. But Blamey was not satisfied with simply pushing them back. He wanted their complete destruction. He ordered his forces to pursue relentlessly, to give the enemy no rest, to turn retreat into rout. And still, MacArthur sent messages questioning Blamey's tactics. Why wasn't the advance happening faster? Why weren't there more dramatic battlefield victories to announce? Blamey ignored them all. He knew what he was doing. The Japanese tried to make a stand at Kokoda village. It was a strategic position, one that could have allowed them to stabilize their lines and resist further Australian advance. Blamey studied the situation and made a decision that shocked his subordinates. He would not launch a frontal assault. Instead, he would use the jungle itself as a weapon. Australian patrols, men who had become ghosts in the jungle, infiltrated behind Japanese lines. They cut supply routes. They ambushed reinforcement columns. They created such chaos and confusion that the Japanese defenders at Kokoda found themselves surrounded and cut off. When the Australian main force finally attacked, the Japanese defense collapsed in hours. November brought the Japanese back to the north coast of Papua, to the beaches where they had first landed with such confidence. They dug in at places called Buna and Gona, creating fortified positions they swore would be impregnable. These were not field positions. These were bunkers built from steel and coconut logs, designed to withstand direct artillery hits. Machine gun nests that covered every approach. And defending them were the remnants of the Japanese forces, men who knew they were fighting for their lives. MacArthur looked at intelligence reports about these positions and made a decision that would haunt him. He ordered a direct assault. American troops, who had finally arrived in theater, would join the Australians in what he promised would be a quick victory. He gave commanders just days to break through defenses that would have taken weeks of preparation to assault properly. The attacks failed catastrophically. American and Australian soldiers charged across open ground into withering machine gun fire. Men died by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The Japanese defenders, cornered and desperate, fought with a fury that stunned even veteran troops. Wounded soldiers kept firing until they were killed. Machine gun crews fought until they were blown apart by grenades. MacArthur, watching his plans collapse, looked for someone to blame. And he found Blamey. Messages flew from MacArthur's headquarters. Blamey was not aggressive enough. The Australian forces lacked fighting spirit. If MacArthur had been in direct command, this would already be over. The criticism was harsh, public, and designed to humiliate. Blamey read these messages in his command post. His staff officers watched his face, expecting anger. Instead, they saw something that unsettled them more, a cold smile. Because Blamey had a plan. And it wasn't the frontal assault MacArthur demanded. He studied the Japanese positions for days. He sent reconnaissance teams who risked their lives to map every bunker, every field of fire, every weakness. And he found what he was looking for. The Japanese had built their defenses to resist frontal assault. They had not adequately protected their flanks. They had assumed the jungle and swamps on either side would be impassable. Blamey knew better. His men had learned to move through terrain others considered impossible. They had become masters of jungle warfare through months of bitter experience. He issued orders that seemed insane to some of his officers. Australian units would move through the swamps that flanked the Japanese positions. They would move at night. They would carry minimal equipment to move faster. And they would get behind the Japanese lines before launching their attack. The night of the infiltration, Australian soldiers moved through swamps where the water came up to their chests. Crocodiles were a real danger. Disease was guaranteed. But they moved in silence, veterans who had learned that noise meant death. By dawn they were in position. Japanese defenders in their bunkers, watching for frontal assault from the expected direction, had no idea that hundreds of Australian soldiers were now behind them. The attack, when it came, was devastating. Japanese positions that had seemed impregnable were assaulted from directions they had never fortified. Machine gun nests found themselves under fire from their own rear. Bunkers that had cost American lives to even approach were grenaded from blind spots. The Japanese defense, so strong from the front, collapsed from the rear. But Blamey wasn't finished. As Japanese forces tried to retreat from Buna to consolidate at Gona, he had already positioned troops to cut them off. The Japanese found themselves trapped between Australian forces in front and behind. Units that tried to break out were cut to pieces. Those that tried to hold position found themselves surrounded and systematically destroyed. Gona fell next. Then Buna. The Japanese tried to evacuate by sea, but Australian and American aircraft turned the waters red. 12,000 Japanese soldiers who had landed with such confidence, who had pushed to within striking distance of Port Moresby, were dead, captured, or scattered into the jungle to die of disease and starvation. The victory was so complete that when the final reports reached Allied headquarters, some officers initially thought they were exaggerated. 12,000 enemy soldiers destroyed. The threat to Port Moresby eliminated. The Japanese advance in Papua New Guinea not just halted but reversed. And casualties on the Allied side, while heavy, were far lower than what MacArthur's frontal assault strategy would have cost. The telegram reached MacArthur's desk on a morning that had started like any other. He opened it expecting another update about the slow progress of the campaign. Instead, he found himself reading about one of the most complete tactical victories of the Pacific War. His aide, standing nearby, saw MacArthur's face go through a rapid series of expressions. Disbelief. Recognition. And then something the aide had never seen before. Genuine respect mixed with embarrassment. MacArthur read the telegram 3 times. Then he called for his chief of staff. When the man arrived, MacArthur handed him the telegram without a word. The chief of staff read it, his eyes widening with each sentence. What happened next became legendary among those who were present. MacArthur, the general who had never admitted error, who had blamed others for every setback, sat down heavily in his chair. He was silent for several minutes. Then he spoke, and his words were so unexpected that those who heard them would repeat them for the rest of their lives. I was wrong about Blamey. 5 words. But they represented a seismic shift. MacArthur, who had spent months criticizing the Australian general, who had questioned his courage and competence, was admitting he had misjudged the man. But MacArthur didn't stop there. In a message that was sent to Blamey and later shared with Australian command, he wrote something even more remarkable. He acknowledged that Blamey's tactics, the very tactics he had criticized as too cautious, had achieved what MacArthur's aggressive strategy had failed to do. He admitted that the Australian general had understood the nature of jungle warfare better than he had. And he thanked Blamey for saving the campaign from the disaster that MacArthur's own orders had nearly created. When Blamey received this message, he showed no triumph. He simply nodded, folded the paper, and returned to the work of caring for his men. Because for Blamey this had never been about ego or recognition. It had been about winning the war in the way that cost the fewest Australian lives. But the story doesn't end with MacArthur's admission. Because the victory at Papua New Guinea changed everything. The Japanese High Command, receiving reports of the catastrophic defeat, was forced to reassess their entire Pacific strategy. The idea of invading Australia was abandoned. Resources that would have been devoted to that campaign were diverted elsewhere. And the myth of Japanese invincibility, already damaged at Midway, took another devastating blow. For Australia, the victory represented something even more profound. This was the first time in the war that Australian forces, under Australian command, had won a major victory without being subordinate to British or American leadership. It proved that the Australian military could stand on its own. It gave a nation that had lived in fear of invasion the confidence that they could defend themselves. The soldiers who fought in Papua New Guinea would carry the scars for the rest of their lives. Many contracted tropical diseases that would plague them for decades. Some suffered psychological trauma that no one at the time understood how to treat. But they had done something extraordinary. They had stopped an empire in its tracks. Years later, historians would analyze Blamey's Papua New Guinea campaign and recognize it as a masterpiece of jungle warfare. His patience in the face of MacArthur's pressure. His understanding that in jungle combat, the force that can endure the terrain will triumph over the force that tries to rush. His use of flanking maneuvers through supposedly impassable terrain. His relentless pursuit that gave the enemy no chance to recover. All of it represented a level of tactical sophistication that was rare in the Pacific War. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect was this. Blamey achieved it with forces that were, on paper, inferior to what they faced. The Australian militia troops who held the initial line were barely trained. The reinforcements who arrived from the Middle East were exhausted from fighting in North Africa. Supplies were always scarce. Air support was minimal compared to later campaigns. And yet they won decisively and completely. MacArthur, to his credit, never again questioned Blamey's tactics in public. In private conversations, he would sometimes refer to the Papua New Guinea campaign as an education in jungle warfare. His own memoirs, written years after the war, acknowledged that his initial strategy had been flawed and that Blamey had been right to pursue a different approach. The relationship between the two generals remained complex. MacArthur could never fully overcome his ego, and Blamey could never fully forgive the criticism that had been heaped on his men during their darkest hours. But there was a mutual respect that had not existed before Papua New Guinea. For the Australian soldiers who survived the campaign, MacArthur's acknowledgement meant little. They had not fought for his approval. They had fought because their nation needed them. They had endured hell because their mates beside them were enduring the same hell. They had won because they refused to give up, even when victory seemed impossible. One veteran, interviewed decades later, was asked what he thought about MacArthur's admission that he had been wrong about Blamey. The old soldier, his body bent by age and disease contracted in the Papua New Guinea jungle, laughed bitterly. MacArthur, he said, learned what we already knew. That you don't measure a soldier by how many medals he wears or how loud he talks. You measure him by whether he stands when others run. And our general stood. And so did we. The Japanese soldiers who faced the Australians in Papua New Guinea wrote in their diaries about an enemy they had not expected. They had assumed, based on initial encounters with poorly trained militia, that the Australians would be easy opponents. What they found instead were soldiers who became more dangerous the longer the campaign went on. Who learned from every engagement. Who adapted to jungle warfare faster than the Japanese had thought possible. In one captured diary, a Japanese officer wrote, "The Australians fight with a ferocity that equals our own, but with a cunning that we cannot match. They do not charge blindly. They wait. They observe. And when they strike, they do so with a precision that leaves us no escape." That precision came from Blamey's leadership. While MacArthur demanded grand gestures and dramatic victories, Blamey focused on the systematic destruction of enemy forces. While MacArthur thought in terms of glory and headlines, Blamey thought in terms of logistics and casualty rates. And in the brutal calculus of war, Blamey's approach proved superior. The Papua New Guinea campaign also revealed something about the nature of generalship that is often overlooked. The best generals are not always the most charismatic or the most aggressive. Sometimes, the best generals are the ones who can resist pressure from above, who can maintain their strategic vision even when criticized, and who can make the hard decisions that save lives even if those decisions don't look heroic in the moment. Blamey's decision to retreat slowly during the Japanese advance saved countless Australian lives. If he had tried to hold every position as MacArthur wanted, his forces would have been surrounded and destroyed. Instead, by trading space for time, he preserved his army until he could counterattack from a position of strength. His decision to pursue relentlessly during the advance turned what could have been a simple reversal into a devastating defeat for the Japanese. By not allowing the enemy to rest or regroup, he prevented them from establishing new defensive lines that would have cost Allied lives to break through. And his decision to use flanking maneuvers at Buna and Gona, despite MacArthur's orders for frontal assault, broke positions that might otherwise have held for months. Each of these decisions was made in the face of intense pressure and criticism. Each required moral courage as much as tactical skill. And each proved correct in the end. The impact of Blamey's victory rippled far beyond Papua New Guinea. It influenced Allied strategy across the Pacific. The lessons learned about jungle warfare were applied in Burma, in the Philippines, and in dozens of smaller campaigns. The tactics Blamey developed became standard operating procedure for Allied forces fighting in tropical terrain. More importantly, it changed how Australia saw itself. Before Papua New Guinea, Australia had always looked to Britain for military leadership and protection. After Papua New Guinea, Australia knew it could defend itself. This psychological shift would influence Australian foreign policy for generations. The 12,000 Japanese soldiers who were destroyed in the campaign represented more than just a tactical victory. They represented the failure of Japan's grand strategy in the Pacific. The plan to cut Australia off from American support, to force it out of the war, to secure the southern flank of the Japanese Empire, all of it collapsed in the jungles of Papua New Guinea. MacArthur's admission that he had been wrong about Blamey was significant not just for what it said about Blamey, but for what it revealed about MacArthur himself. It showed that even the most egotistical general could, when faced with undeniable evidence, acknowledge his mistakes. It was a rare moment of humility from a man not known for humility, but it also showed the limits of that acknowledgement. MacArthur never publicized his admission widely. He never issued a public apology for the criticism he had heaped on Australian forces. He never fully credited Blamey for the victory in his public statements. The acknowledgement was private, perhaps because MacArthur's ego could not bear the public humiliation of admitting he had been so completely wrong. Blamey, for his part, never sought public vindication. He never tried to embarrass MacArthur or to claim more credit than he deserved. He simply continued to do his job, leading Australian forces through the rest of the war with the same methodical competence he had shown in Papua New Guinea. There's a deeper lesson in this story about the nature of leadership and recognition. History tends to remember the loudest voices, the most dramatic personalities. MacArthur, with his pipe and his sunglasses and his flair for dramatic pronouncements, became one of the most famous generals of World War II. Blamey, quieter and less concerned with his image, faded from popular memory. But among those who study military history seriously, among those who understand the complexities of jungle warfare and the challenges of coalition command, Blamey's Papua New Guinea campaign is recognized as one of the finest pieces of generalship in the Pacific War. It was a victory achieved through patience, tactical sophistication, and an understanding of terrain and logistics that MacArthur, for all his brilliance in other areas, simply did not possess. The soldiers who fought under Blamey knew this. They knew that their general had saved their lives by refusing to follow MacArthur's orders for suicidal frontal assaults. They knew that the victory they had won was achieved through intelligent tactics rather than wasteful bravery. One sergeant, writing home after the campaign, put it simply, "We won because our general was smarter than their general. And because he was smarter than our supreme commander too, though you won't read that in the newspapers." That unofficial verdict, passed among the troops, was perhaps the highest compliment Blamey could have received. Because soldiers know. They know when their lives are being wasted by poor leadership. And they know when they're being led by someone who actually cares whether they come home. The Japanese forces that were destroyed in Papua New Guinea left behind diaries, letters, and documents that revealed the human cost of their defeat. These men had families waiting for them in Japan. They had hopes and dreams beyond military service. And they died in a jungle hell, thousands of miles from home, in service of an empire that would ultimately bring their nation to ruin. There's no glory in their deaths, just as there's no glory in any war death. But their defeat in Papua New Guinea saved Australian lives. It saved the lives of civilians who would have suffered under Japanese occupation. And it helped bring the war closer to an end. The campaign cost Australia dearly. Casualties were in the thousands. Disease affected tens of thousands more. The economic cost was enormous for a nation of limited resources. But the alternative, inviting invasion, losing Port Moresby, watching the Japanese establish a foothold that would take years of bloody fighting to dislodge, would have been infinitely worse. Blamey understood this calculus. He understood that every day he could extend the Japanese supply lines, every ambush his men conducted, every tactical victory they achieved, brought the war closer to its conclusion. He was fighting not just to win battles but to save his nation. MacArthur's telegram acknowledging Blamey's success arrived at a moment when Blamey needed no validation. He had just achieved one of the most complete tactical victories of the Pacific War. His men had proven themselves against a supposedly invincible enemy, and Australia was safe. But the telegram mattered nonetheless, because it represented a shift in how the Allied High Command viewed Australian forces. No longer would they be seen as secondary troops, suitable only for garrison duty or supporting roles. After Papua New Guinea, Australian forces were recognized as elite jungle fighters, capable of achieving what other Allied forces could not. This recognition would lead to Australian forces being given leading roles in subsequent campaigns. In Borneo, in the final phases of the New Guinea campaign, in numerous smaller operations across the Pacific. Australian soldiers, led by Australian commanders, would continue to prove their worth until the war's end. The relationship between Blamey and MacArthur never became warm. They were too different in temperament and style. But it became professional, built on mutual respect earned through the fires of Papua New Guinea. When MacArthur needed troops for difficult jungle operations, he increasingly turned to Australian forces. And when Blamey needed support for his campaigns, MacArthur provided it without the criticism that had characterized their earlier relationship. Years after the war, a journalist asked MacArthur about his greatest military mistake. The old general, near the end of his life, thought for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised everyone present. "I underestimated the Australians. I thought they needed American leadership to be effective. I was wrong." It wasn't a full admission. MacArthur could never quite bring himself to say explicitly that Blamey had been right and he had been wrong. But for those who understood the context, the meaning was clear. Blamey died in 1951, 6 years after the war ended. His funeral was attended by thousands of veterans who had served under him. Many wept openly, men who had faced death in the jungles of Papua New Guinea breaking down as they remembered the general who had led them to victory. MacArthur sent a wreath. The card attached carried a simple message: to a worthy opponent and a great soldier. The Papua New Guinea campaign remains one of the most studied military operations of World War II. Military academies around the world use it as a case study in jungle warfare, logistics, and coalition command. The tactical innovations Blamey introduced are still taught today. But beyond the tactical lessons, there's a human story that deserves to be remembered. It's the story of soldiers who endured unimaginable hardship because their nation needed them. It's the story of a general who had the courage to resist pressure from his superiors because he knew a better way. And it's the story of a victory that changed the course of the war and saved a nation from invasion. When MacArthur held that telegram in his hands, reading the words that confirmed Blamey's complete victory, he wasn't just acknowledging a tactical success. He was acknowledging that leadership comes in many forms. That the loud, aggressive commander is not always the most effective. That sometimes the greatest victories come from those who plan carefully, who understand their enemy, and who have the patience to wait for the right moment to strike. 12,000 Japanese soldiers died in Papua New Guinea. Their sacrifice was not in vain. From their perspective, they were defending their empire and following orders. But their defeat saved countless lives on all sides by bringing the war closer to its end. And at the center of it all was a general who most people have forgotten. Thomas Blamey, who never sought glory, who endured criticism and doubt, who saved his nation through skill and determination. His reward was not fame or widespread recognition. His reward was the knowledge that he had done his duty, protected his men, and secured victory when it mattered most. MacArthur's admission, those 5 words, "I was wrong about Blamey," represented more than just acknowledgement of a tactical victory. They represented the recognition that true military genius is not always loud, is not always obvious, and does not always look like what we expect. The soldiers who fought in Papua New Guinea carried scars for the rest of their lives. Physical scars from disease and combat. Psychological scars from months of unrelenting stress and horror. But they also carried pride. They had faced one of history's most formidable military forces and defeated it completely. They had proven that courage and skill could triumph over numerical superiority and supposed invincibility. And they had done it under a general who, despite being criticized and doubted, never wavered in his commitment to bringing them home alive. That is the true story of what MacArthur said when Blamey crushed 12,000 Japanese soldiers. It's not just about military tactics or strategic victories. It's about leadership, courage, and the price of defending what matters most.